On debate, Senator Audette. Thank you, Madam Speaker. The Indigenous peoples, and of course, honourable senators, I rise today to speak to Bill C-226, an act respecting the development of a national strategy to assess, prevent, and address environmental racism and to advance environmental justice. Before that, I did my homework in order to better understand this definition, where it comes from. And what I understand is that it refers to the set of environmental policies, practices, and directives that have disproportionately negative consequences, whether intentional or unintentional, on certain individuals, certain groups, and even certain communities because of their race or color, according to Robert Bullard, who is the father of environmental justice. Over the course of that exercise, I also understand, and I'm quoting Ms. Elizabeth May in her speech at second reading of this bill, on the current bill. One of the lessons I learned from cleaning up the Sydney tar ponds with Ms. Yakimchuk is that we can recognize that toxic chemicals do not discriminate. They do not care what color our skin is when they lodge in our bodies, when they cross the placenta to reach our infants, when they cause cancer, and when they cause birth defects. They do not care about the color of our skin. However, the public policy that exposes Indigenous peoples and communities of color to toxic chemicals much more often does care about skin color. It notices if we are marginalized or not. It notices whether we have money or not. End of quote. Among the First Peoples, environmental racism has been experienced since the doctrine of discovery, born of the Romanus Pontifex Bull of 1455. According to the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, this doctrine, related to the older concept of terra nullius, enshrined the principle that any Christian monarch who discovered non-Christian lands had the right to proclaim them their own, as if no one was there. And it took 568 years before the Vatican repudiated that doctrine of discovery. On a personal level, as you can understand, it's one more step towards reconciliation, a significant one. But what I can tell you today in 2023 is that the plundering of land and resources, the enclaving or confinement of reserves, unfortunately remain all too real today. The damage and negative impacts continue to be felt to this day. Environmental racism is also at the root of the impoverishment of communities and the loss of culture, as well as our customs. That same environmental racism has also helped to deplete our supply of food. Environmental racism is also involved in the development of mining projects without community input or consent. Unfortunately, it also destroys and pollutes the environment of that community, its fauna, flora, and waterways. Where I live, Shefferville, is the largest 18-hole course in the world. But don't get too excited. We're not talking about golf. We're talking about pit holes. In this same community, as testified by Mr. Conrad André, who questioned in a June 8, 2022 article published in Radio-Canada, how is it that the IOC mining company makes billions of dollars but that there is not a single Innu millionaire here? According to this report, it was Mathieu André, an Innu born in the woods 50 kilometers northwest of Shefferville, who discovered the first mining deposit in the 1930s near Knob Lake. That discovery was partly responsible for the beginning of the iron rush in the region along the Labrador and Quebec border. Mr. André is now in the land of the caribou. But his son Luc says that following his father's discovery, Labrador mines was allowed to exploit the territory. Labrador Mining, rather, was allowed to exploit the territory when it promised a percentage of the profits from the deposits to the population and to the Innu. However, he notes, we never received a thing. We met with the company, and they ended up telling us that if they're, and we said to them, they said, well, we'll have to give it to everyone if we give it to you.
Jim First Nation is surrounded by 50 industrial plants within a 24 kilometers radius of its territory. Their people are disproportionately exposed to toxic substances such as sulfur, dioxide, benzene, mercury, and others. A 30-year-old chair of the local environment community, Namabin, says she has grown increasingly frustrated at seeing her community shoulder the health risk of industry operating in the area. And I quote her here, "Quite frankly, we've been here for millennia, forever. For us to have continuously to be the one accommodating, I am done with that. I am done with this having to compromise our health, our mental well-being, our safety for everybody else," she says. She also adds asthma and other breathing problems, along with rashes, headache, and high cancer rates are among the most prevalent health issues on the reserve. Shelburne, Nova Scotia. According to a CBC interview, and Louise Delisle, a resident of Shelburne, the community history with cancer disease and death are connected to the dumping ground for industrial and sometimes even medical waste just around the corner. I'm quoting Madame Delisle here. "The majority of the Black men in the community have died from cancer. There's a community of widows in Shelburne. That's what it is." End of quote. We also find a map compiled by Environmental Noxious Racial Inequities and Community Health, the acronyms ENRICH. The project shows dozens of waste disposal sites in close proximity to community, either Black community, Indigenous population, and the map also encompasses dozens of stories similar to Shelburne, where we can find a dump, slaughterhouse, built near Halifax, Africville, in the late 1700s, a paper mills influent bound next to the Pictou Landed First Nation, and yet more landfills built in the Black community of Lincolnville in Guysborough Country. Dr. Ingrid Waldron, who is also a co-producer of the film There's Something in the Waters, and I quote her here, "It's not only about health and stress, it's about lack of power. It's about you've placed certain industry in certain communities without consulting with them. You've taken away their power, you've taken away their voice, and you've placed in communities that not only racialize but also poor." End of quote.
The Horn Smelter, located in Rouyn-Noranda, Quebec. It's also been criticized for releasing 23 contaminants in amounts exceeding acceptable levels, and it will now expand a buffer zone. That means 200 homes will be demolished. We're talking about families who will have to be relocated. Quebecers. Why? Because the smelter benefits from an exemption from Quebec's airborne arsenic emission standards, since it was in operation long before these environmental standards came into force. Do I need to tell you that young children in the area have a concentration of arsenic in their fingernails that is 4 times too high? In 1940, swimming was prohibited in Lake Osisko between Noranda and Rouyn. In 1979, the Quebec government was informed of the dangers of the Horn smelter. for children who had arsenic levels in their hair that were 2 to 3 times higher in the district where the smelter is located.
Have been raised in the official Journal of Family Medicine last August. The abstract to this article reads as follows. You are a family physician doing a locum in northwestern Ontario. Your next patient is 6 years old, child, who present with chronic fatigues and paresthesia in their extremities. Upon physical examination, you also discover bilateral hearing impairment. You recall reading in the news that years ago, 10,000 kilograms of mercury were dumped into the Wabigoon River, thereby polluting downstream water and poisoning the fish that sustain communities such as Grassy Narrow First Nation. In addition to other investigation, you conduct a 24-hour urine mercury test for the patient and ascertain that they have abnormal mercury level. How do you treat this patient? How do you respond to this issue in the community level? To what extent do you consider how the environment, history, and economic factors contributed to this patient presentation? End of quote. Despite the fact that we know that Indigenous communities are often the most impacted when the worst happen, like the two oil spills in Alberta last year, were identified months before First Nation were notified. Alors,
the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples constitutes the minimum standards necessary for the survival, dignity, and well-being of Indigenous peoples around the world, and it must be implemented here in Canada. A national strategy to assess and prevent environmental racism must be rooted in the UN Declaration and focus the voice of the original custodians of these lands.
Another interesting solution are put forward by author of the official journal Family Medicine and that strategy that should take into account. First, as healthcare provider and Canadians, we need to educate ourselves about the true history of Canada. The second one, we should become aware that environmental racism exists in our country. As per the CADMED Family Medicine Indigenous Health Supplement, we must challenge the system that we work into make changes to racist processes and policy. We know racialized community and disproportionately affected by environmental hazard. As we know, this has profound health implications. If we want to address health from a proactive and preventive start point, we must advocate for sustainable change and listen to the voice of those who are affected. End of quote. Plus facile en français pour terminer.
Education, a public voice in environmental decision-making, community self-determination in water, food production, housing distribution, energy and transportation matters, and a charter of environmental rights must be part of such a strategy. In short, environmental racism is definitely real in Canada. As the United Nations has stated, a healthy environment is a right. So let's empower ourselves to address this racism and advance environmental justice. And I'll say once again, we cannot change history, but we have a responsibility to change the present, to assume more responsibility to repair the mistakes of the past and write a new chapter together. Thank you, Senators, for listening. Of course, I support this bill, and together I know we have the power to make a difference and do great things.